So it'll just be a second before we go live on YouTube. And Carrie, do you have that open to check that for me to make sure?
I do. I'm just trying to see, how do I minimize your screen now? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I can't either.
You can, if you go on the top next to the big green bar, it says view options, you pick exit full screen. And then we're able to refresh. If you go on the top next to the big green bar,
Thank you.
There we go. You can still hear me okay?
Yep. All right, it's live, so I see that. One person's watching.
I don't know how I did that. Carrie, do you remember how I mute the live?
How do you mute on YouTube?
Yeah. Oh, I see it. I got it.
Yeah, it's right on the bottom.
All these funny things. There we go. That's so we don't get that back feed. Okay. So we probably start letting people in, Carrie. We're ready. Hello, everyone. As you're coming on to or signing into Zoom, welcome. We'll begin our presentation momentarily. About little less than half of our participants have come into the Zoom room. So we're going to have a little bit of a delay here just to make sure that we get everybody in. One thing that I will talk a bit more specifically about in my introductions is we are streaming live onto YouTube on the Hyde's YouTube page. So if you're looking to retain some of your privacy, you may want to change the names on your Zoom screen if you have a private phone number listed, or please feel free to hide your camera view.
Hey, Jenny, so where are you?
Where am I?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm in Glens Falls, actually.
Cool.
Yeah, I live locally, just a couple blocks from the museum.
That's great.
Okay, so we're almost there with participants coming into Zoom. Again, for anyone who is newly entering the room, we're going to have a delay here of about 5 minutes before we get started, just to ensure that we have everyone into the Zoom room that is wanting to be before we get started. And I'm also announcing, just for your own knowledge, that we are streaming live to YouTube. So please keep that in mind as you're kind of sharing your video view. It's nice to see so many participants.
How many we have?
28 so far.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, more coming. You're popular, Tim.
Or the topic is.
More coming in. Just give it a couple more minutes here. Sometimes those Zoom links are hard to navigate, right?
So how's the foliage up your way? Is it past peak?
It is just starting to get past peak. I think this weekend is probably what we would have technically designated as peak.
Okay.
My backyard wasn't full yet with leaves, and now it is.
Cool. Ready to rake those leaves up.
Oh yeah. We have the most giant tree in the neighborhood, so it really drops quite a few. But it's been a beautiful season,
Yeah.
for sure. Okay. So I think we're starting to slow down here with participants coming in. So let's see. I'm going to stop our screen share. And Tim, if you're feeling ready, I might begin our introductions, and then we'll do our formal introductions and turn it over to you. How do you feel? All right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm ready.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to get us started. I'm Jenny Hutchinson, Curator of Education at the Hyde Collection. We thank you for joining us on this wonderful evening for a presentation inspired by Lake George area landscape photographers. I'm so very pleased to host our guest speaker tonight, Tim Weiner, who is the Executive Director of our neighbor museum and friend, the Chapman Museum. Before I introduce Tim, I'd like to share some brief announcements. This presentation, in addition to Zoom, is also streaming live on the Hyde Collection's YouTube page and is also being recorded. The video will remain on our YouTube page following this evening for further review or to share with friends if you particularly enjoy it. With this in mind, please feel free to hide your camera feed or change your Zoom name if you want to retain some privacy. As you likely noticed, we have muted your microphones to ensure everyone can hear the presentation comfortably. However, we do welcome your questions throughout the presentation. If you are watching by Zoom, please place these comments in the chat feed. You can locate this button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. It's labeled chat, and you can place your questions there. If you're watching from YouTube, you can add some questions to the comments, and we will be keeping track of them. And we'll address them as time allows following Tim's presentation. And we'll also be taking some questions live should you feel comfortable. This program is inspired by our current exhibition, J.S. Wooley, Adirondack Photographer, on view in Wood Gallery at the Hyde Collection. Even though our programming is presently online, the museum is open to visitors Friday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Sorry. Reservations are required so that we can control numbers for your safety and comfort. And you can make a reservation by visiting our website, www.hydecollection.org. For our Zoom participants, we'll place this information in the chat feed so that you have it. For our viewers streaming online, we'll be adding it to the video description, and we'll also include a link so that you can check out Chapman Museum if you're not yet familiar or already a big fan. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Tim Weiner. He has been the Executive Director of the Chapman Museum for 22 years. The topic of historic photography, as he's illuminating tonight, is both his particular expertise and his passion. Thank you, Tim, for joining us tonight, and we're looking forward to learning more about these regional photographers that were equally captivated by the Lake George region as J.S. Wooley was.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome.
What I want to say before we get started is that with any topic that I get into, There is a discovery opportunity, I find, so I'm inviting you to come along that with me. And with that, we will get started. As Jenny said, this particular talk was sort of inspired and started by the exhibition that's currently at the Hyde Collection. And I've been somewhat aware of J.S. Wooley. I'd seen the book that came out a couple years ago. And it actually is just a great springboard for looking at a lot of photography that has been inspired by the landscape of Lake George. Originally, we even toyed with the idea of calling it not Stoddard, because the easy thing to do is to sort of leap to talking about Seneca Ray Stoddard. That's the topic that I probably know best of anything, but we are going to skip over that pretty quickly tonight. Instead, we want to talk about other photographers, and I've discovered quite a few and have far more images than you probably care to see. So I'm going to move through them fairly quickly as we get into the program. The first image here that you see is one that's actually in the exhibition at the Hyde Collection.
Tim, we actually can't see it yet.
Really?
Yep, nope, not yet.
Oh.
Yep. Before you get too far.
So before I go any further, what image do you see?
Right now, we're just seeing our faces, so we don't have the screen sharing yet turned on.
Really?
No.
Let me go back. Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yep. Now we're there.
Okay.
Perfect.
One button forgotten. Okay, so here we are. This is a J.S. Wooley photograph of Lake George, and this is just a starter for my talk this evening. But for those people that are not familiar with J.S. Wooley, I'll just provide a little brief background on him and then encourage you to go see the exhibit at the Hyde Collection. Wooley was born in Wilton, New York in 1867. His family then moved to the Saratoga area, where he got a job working with a Saratoga photographer. Completed an apprenticeship there, and by 1887 had bought his own studio in Ballston Spa. In 1893, Seneca Ray Stoddard invited him to go on a tour through the Adirondacks, which they did together, and then assembled that into a lecture, which was the first of many that Wooley did throughout his career. And in 1908, sorry, my navigation is not working real well here. There we go. In 1908, he opened a studio and gift shop at Silver Bay on Lake George. One of the things that he did was produce many postcards, which are pretty distinctive. They're almost recognizable from a distance because the identification, it was handwritten on the postcard, and it's a distinctive hand. I've included a couple of photographs here from our collection here at the Chapman Museum. They're not ones you're necessarily going to see in the exhibit at the Hyde Collection, just to provide a little variety to what we're going to see today. These are a couple of postcards that Wooley did, and this is another really unusual one that I found, which is a moonlight photograph on Lake George, and another one which is one of his panoramic postcards. And what's really interesting about this one is that it's been hand colored. If you look closer, you can see that on some of the details. In 1915, Wooley sold his studio in Ballston Spa but continued on with the studio and gift shop that he had at Silver Bay. And one of the most unusual things that I found about Wooley is that he was actually able to retire. In 1923, he retired at age 56, which is a little dismaying for me, as I'm well past that at this point. But he continued to run his studio and his gift shop at Silver Bay for a few more years. And he passed away in 1940, just sort of to wrap up Wooley. Now, I'd referenced Seneca Ray Stoddard and the fact that he and Wooley had done a trip together. And so I'm going to just touch quickly on Seneca Ray Stoddard. He perhaps is one of the more famous photographers from the Adirondack region. He also was born in Wilton, as Wooley had been. A few years earlier, 20-some years earlier, he was born in 1843, sorry. And in his late teens, he moved to Troy and became a painter of railway cars. That was decorative painting, murals, that sort of thing. And in 1864, he moved to Glens Falls, initially setting up as a painter, called himself an artist. But by 1867, he was doing photography. Some have suggested that he had apprenticed with another photographer that was already in business here that we'll talk about next. I haven't found any strong proof of that, but it could certainly be true. He learned it from somebody. Stoddard was an incredibly imaginative individual. He also was a tinkerer. When you did photography in the 1860s, it was a hand process. He hand coated his glass plate negatives, processed them in the field. He had to learn how to read the light conditions. The chemistry was very specific. So it took a multitude of skills to become a good photographer in the 1860s, and Stoddard succeeded at that. Submitting his photographs to national photography magazines, writing articles. He definitely established a name for himself in that time period. In 1873, he did his first trip into the Adirondacks to take photographs, which he then made into stereo views. A couple examples I've included here that he sold to the people that were coming to the area for extended stays in the summer to experience the wildlands of the Adirondacks. Even Lake George, even though many of the hotels were really quite nice. By 1870, he was advertising that he actually had 2,000 views that were available for people to purchase. He would sell them in hotels throughout the Adirondack region, and he did quite well at that for a period of time. I think it's interesting that he did the work in the field. He would shoot the photographs and then bring them back to Glens Falls, where his base was, where his family lived. And his wife made the prints in an upper story of their house where there was a big window that allowed skylight. So she did all the printing back here in Glens Falls. In the 1870s, Stoddard also started publishing guides to the Adirondacks, maps, and he annually updated them. So he'd have to take repeated trips around to visit hotels, get the most recent information. He'd do correspondence with all these places. And in his later years, he actually referred to himself more as a publisher than a photographer. He also became a lecturer, as Wooley did as well. One thing that he was known for was his mastery of light. And this, I think, is a wonderful example of what he was capable of doing with that technology that was available at that time. So enough of Stoddard. Well, no, one more, sorry. This is another one taken in the Narrows. And if you are interested and learning more about Stoddard, specifically about his photography on Lake George. A couple years ago, I worked with Joe Cutshall-King, and we came out with this wonderful book called Water and Light, which is available for purchase. You can even get it on Amazon. So if you want to learn more about Stoddard, go there. With that, we need to move on to somebody new. George Conkey. I mentioned that Stoddard must have learned some of his photographic skills from somebody else, and it most likely was George Conkey. He was born in 1837 in New York City. He learned his photography skills there and then moved to Glens Falls in 1861. So he was here briefly before Stoddard was. He was known actually for his educating many other photographers. He was in partnership with quite a few different partnerships over the years. People went through his studio where they worked as printers, learned the trade, then went out on their own and tried to compete with him, but he outlasted most of them. He actually was in business for 40 some years here in Glens Falls. A large part of his business was portrait photography, which he did in his studio in the center of town. But it's interesting to see that he did travel to Lake George and take photographs there as well. And I have a number of them here for you. This is the Fort William Henry, this is a photograph after it was drastically remodeled in the 1860s, showing it in its grandeur at the south end of Lake George. To give you an idea of what it was like to visit this hotel. This is the office area where you would have signed in. Nearby, you could take a trip up to the top of Prospect Mountain or across the lake to Crosby Side. Here's a photograph of one thing that many photographers took pictures of. It was Ship Island, also known as Sloop Island. It's hard to find it now because what made it distinctive was the tree, and it just didn't survive over time. Another place that a lot of photographers visited was the residence of Colonel Price, and what was really known about this was the grounds were filled with plaster sculptures. Here we are near Bolton Landing at the Mohican House, looking at their dock. These stereo views were very popular because they could be sold in the area hotels and in stores, and people would buy them, could take them home and share them with their friends to show off where they spent their summer. One of the things that people could do, you could stay in a great hotel or you could camp on one of the islands. It's a very popular thing for people to do, even large groups. Here's a picture of the remains of one of the camps. This falls also was photographed by more than one photographer. There's one that's extremely similar that I know Stoddard did, opposite Sabbath Day Point on the east side of the lake. And to finish up Conkey, I'll just mention that he continued working in photography until actually his eyesight started failing. And following that, I think if I remember correctly reading, he ended up working in a store. That's what he could do after all those years of being a photographer. The last two that I'll include, he did a series of the Sagamore. Here is one that's looking east at Green Island, I believe, from the main shore. And here one taken from the Sagamore across the lake. And what's interesting about this was a little bit later photograph, probably taken close to 1890, I'm guessing, but it shows how the photographic materials had improved at that point to he could actually capture some clouds in the sky, whereas previously photographers would have to actually take a picture of sort of the scene in front of them and take a different picture of the sky and then print the two together in order to include both in an image. But here in this photo, the sky is actually captured on the emulsion. George Irish is another photographer who was quite prolific, took pictures of Lake George at the same time, many of these stereo views. But very little is known about him other than he was born in Caldwell in 1847. And by 1870, he listed himself in the census as a photographist, a rather unusual term that wasn't used often, and he didn't persist with it either. He continued to work as a photographer into the 1890s, but by then things had changed a lot, and he ended up running a variety store for the remainder of his working life. I think let me show you some of his photographs. I have many, so I will move through them fairly quickly just to show what he could do. Sorry, the previous one. This is a great, actually, document of the Fort William Henry Hotel, taken before a lot of the trees grew up around it, so it shows what it looked like in its early days. Also, what's interesting about it is you'll see the wooden boardwalks that people use to navigate to avoid having to walk through the mud. Nice, great historical document. Here's the Fort William Henry, which he has in this view. He's framed it with a couple trees. North from the Fort William Henry Hotel dock, another popular photograph for people to take. It was just, you couldn't resist it. It was this open space that looked to the north, and you captured the whole lake. Here he's used a tree in the foreground to provide a sense of scale in this photograph that depicts the Minnehaha in the background at the dock. Here we are in Caldwell. This is the Lake House, one of the old hotels located in Caldwell. And there's a couple photographs here I included just because they're sort of a pair. This is Prospect Mountain from the lake, and he went up to the top of the mountain and took a picture of the lake from the top of Prospect. And this is the Prospect Mountain House, which was located on the top of the mountain. To get around the lake at that time, you traveled by steamboat. The roads usually only went short distances. The train didn't lend itself to getting around the lake other ways very easily. So the favorite way to get around was by steamboat. They ranged from little ones like this one to the Minnehaha, which we showed earlier. And they could also take you to the various islands around the lake from the southeast end all the way up through the Narrows. Here we have one along Long Island. Could cross the lake to Shelving Rock. About halfway up the lake on the east side is 14 Mile Island House. And people would buy these as mementos, as I had mentioned. Recluse Island. And I don't know the exact location of this. I have never seen it anywhere else, so it's a bit of a mystery to me, although the rock should be pretty distinctive. Bolton. What's interesting about this one, they would use stereo views. The cardboard backing was something that would be printed in advance. In this case here, he reused one that has a different identification on it, just scratched it out, put in the correct identification for the hotel. Hague. And here's a photo of Roger's slide. And what really stood out to me with this photo was that it's kind of austere. because I immediately thought of photographs of the same thing that I'd seen Stoddard do. And forgive me, but I have to show you a comparison here of a couple of different stereo views that Stoddard did, just to show how he could take things to another level with his photography. Basically, Roger Slide is a rock that just rises out of the water, but he was able to frame it by positioning himself so that he'd capture this sort of gnarled tree in the foreground, so it frames the rock. And on the right, what he's done quite often, he would set up these photographs and had the people in the boat position themselves so that he could use it as part of his composition in this photograph. I included that just to show how incredibly competitive it was. There were quite a few photographers all doing photography, doing these stereo views around the lake at the same time. And some of them did well, others did not do so well. Here's another one, L.H. Billmore. His story is a little different. We tend to think from the perspective of the south end of the lake, and Mr. Fillmore actually operated out of Ticonderoga. He was born in Addison County, Vermont in 1836, and for a period of time actually moved out to Illinois, where he worked as a farmer, served in the Civil War, and by the 1870s, he's back in this area, living in Whitehall. And in 1879, he advertises that he set up a photography business in Ticonderoga. And he offered to accompany people, as he put it, on a few days of ramble and of recreation on the shores of this beautiful lake. And if you look at much of his photography, it sort of fits that description. And here's another picture of Paradise Bay, sort of typical stereo views, but then it changes. What he did was he would connect with these families that had long-term leases, had camps on the lakes where they would go for the summer, and he would return and photograph them while they're doing things at their place on the lake. Here is Ranger Island, where the Ranger family would go each summer, a fairly large extended family. So in addition to their arrival, he photographed their cabin or their camp, take photographs of them recreating. He was right there with them. I'm not sure really what's happening in this view. I've never been able to figure it out, but it looks quite intriguing. Photographs of them boating, many pictures of them boating, I should say. Another group that he photographed over the years was the Glen Club, which was a group of Glens Falls businessmen and close friends that would go up to their island and camp for a few weeks each summer. Basically, they boated, fished. I've even seen guns in their photographs, ate, and had campfires, I guess. But he took many photographs of this particular group. The group portrait, who was there that week? You'll notice in the Glen Club, one of the families that was mentioned was the Laphams, Jerome Lapham and his brother. The Laphams also had a cottage on Phantom Island, and Mr. Fillmore photographed them there as well. I mentioned that in 1879, he advertised that he was offering this service. In 1894, he actually was able to get a lease on Uncas Island to have a photo studio, which gave him a place right in the middle of everything where he could spend time in the summer, process his photographs and deliver them to people in a fairly quick time. He wouldn't have to go back to Glens Falls or up to Ticonderoga and then make a repeat trip later. He could function right there in the middle of the lake. Here's a birthday event. I have a couple other photographers to mention. This is Alexander Orr. Often on his card, you see Aor and son. I don't know who the son was. Found out a little bit about Alexander. He was born in Queensbury, on a farm in Queensbury. He trained with George Conkey, like many others did. And by 1870, he was out on his own. We don't have very many photographs of his, but I'll include a few that he took. This is one that I haven't seen anybody else do. It's the first I've seen of Witch's Island. I have no idea where Witch's Island is. I'm sure somebody will tell me. Down the lake from Catskill House on the east side. And on the back of it is written this description of, by probably the person that purchased it, one of the loveliest spots on the lake. Cool and shady, with pleasant drives and walks, splendid rowboats, large, airy, well-furnished rooms, a well-supplied table, and attentive servants. Often there was a relationship between the photographer and specific hotels. In fact, for some of them, I know Stoddard even would produce booklets featuring the sites around a particular hotel. Or did not stay in the area. He moved to North Carolina for a period of time, and but then did come back and set up business in Sandy Hill, later in Fort Edward, where he worked the remainder of his days doing photography based out of Fort Edward. I have one photograph, only one photograph by George Baldwin, who actually was a very important photographer. I looked and looked and looked, could not find any others. He was incredibly prolific. He was based in Keysville, but at one point did make it down to take this photograph of the Twin Mountains on the west side of the lake. But what he was known for was actually photographs throughout the Adirondacks. He met Stoddard, we think, perhaps, when Stoddard made his first trip to try to take photographs of Ausable Chasm and then go into the Adirondacks. At that time, Baldwin was running a store located in Keysville that sold photographs that had been taken by other photographers, some from New England, other places, that came there to photograph that particular attraction. And then the store would sell their photographs. In fact, it could well be that Baldwin was making prints from their negatives and selling them out of the store. He did get into photography himself, set up studios in numerous towns in the region, ended up moving his business to Plattsburgh and then on to Lake Placid for a period of time. And there are many photographs that he took throughout the Adirondacks that have survived, and they're in collections that are available. You can find many of them online. He then moved around, in 1905, moved to Vermont. His wife was getting ill. She had a sister that lived there, so he relocated to Vermont and continued to practice photography there until 1930, when he sadly was killed in an auto accident. Here I want to sort of go in a little bit different direction. There were two sisters who lived in Hague, the Sexton sisters, as they're often called, but Teresa the older and Flora the younger, who did photography in Hague. And their photography is a little different. It's not the commercial photography, the stereo views that we've been looking at, but more they're sort of a portrait of their community. I did find one sort of just general landscape view from the lake in winter, But most of the photographs that have survived that they took sort of feature the landscape, but what people are doing in the landscape. Many of the people are not identified. That's been lost to time, but they do give a sense of what the town of Hague was like. They lived there year round, and this is their home. And these portraits of people sort of in situ give a sense of how their lives relate to the landscape. And that's why I really wanted to include that. It's so different from what we looked at in the other photographs. The sisters are part of this community, and they're photographing the people around them. Some are family members, others are just neighbors. Here's a hunting group. Smith Sexton, obviously a family member. Some builders. They actually would set, before I leave the Sextons, I'll just mention that they would set up a photography tent. And that's where they would work out of each summer. Another photographer, it's actually two photographers, father and son, Jewel being the father and Fred the son, who actually became important photographers more in the early 20th century. So they come along largely after Stoddard had wrapped up his career. There definitely was an overlap, but you'll see there's quite a difference in their subject matter and even the nature of the photographs. According to family legend, Jewel Thatcher, the father, who had been born in Ticonderoga, he took his first photograph when he was 11 years old, which I think is pretty amazing. At one point, he worked for Seneca Ray Stoddard. Again, there's lots of connections here. And worked in a store in Lake George where he made tintypes. In 1874, he opened his own studio in Bolton Landing. And he took photographs largely in that area of the people that had the summer homes there, the wealthy residents, and the things that they did around their summer residence. Here we have a picture of, it's an unidentified group of band members that worked at a hotel somewhere on the lake, we don't know where. The crew of the Sagamore, shortly after the boat was introduced to the lake in the early 20th century. And then 20 to 30 years later, these photographs are probably taken by Fred, his son, who actually opened up his studio in Caldwell, or Lake George Village as it was called at that time. And he continued to take photographs of some of the activities of the wealthy summer residents. There's a whole series of them that he did of Marcella Sembrick and the activities that she had around her place in Bolton. And many of these are now found online. I'll mention that a couple years ago, I'm not exactly sure how many, the Thatcher collection was given to the Bolton History Museum. And they're in the process of organizing that collection and I think they had hoped to do an exhibit this past summer, but due to circumstances, they weren't able to do that. But last I knew, it was in the offing. And this is an incredible collection of photographs taken by the Thatcher father and son. Here are a few more pictures taken around Bayview. And you'll see they have a very different look and feel from the stereo views that were so popular 30, 40 years earlier, or even more. But they show the significance of the lake to the people that were living there. Because the Thatchers lived on the lake, they were there all the time. So they could capture the events as they happened. And here I've included a few that were fairly small snapshots, but they captured things that happened. Some planes that had gone through the ice, a boathouse fire in 1932, trotters racing on the ice in winter. And there are other events as well. Here is a photograph of one of the float planes, either picking up passengers or dropping them off at a dock in Lake George. And the bottom photo shows Teddy Roosevelt climbing into a boat. So they captured these events that were happening around the lake. Fred Thatcher was another prolific postcard photographer, and you'll find many of his postcards still around. For a change of pace, I want to look at a couple other photographers that came to the lake, a little bit different. And they're both people that typically are thought of as artists. They're famous photographers. The first one, Edward Steichen, who was invited to come to the lake by Alfred Stieglitz and came here with his young bride in 1903. And Steichen is known as a pictorialist. And they tended to put a lot of emphasis upon handcraft in their printing, and a lot of work in the darkroom. He excelled with certain processes, one in particular, the gum bichromate process. Don't ask me to explain it, but essentially you're adding layers to the photographic print after you initially make it. At one point he wrote, "Every photograph is a fake from start to finish. A purely impersonal, unmanipulated photograph being practically impossible." Having said that, he did some, what I think are amazing photographs, including a couple here at Lake George. Another one, this is a direct carbon print. Don't ask me to explain that either. Basically, it's using carbon, as you might expect, but it's a fairly complicated process. That's what the first print was. And below you see one that was done a couple of years later as a halftone. And all the reproductions that I've seen of that, they're all reversed, as you see here. So I think it's interesting to see them together. And it just sort of shows how the initial negative is only a starting point, and the finished print involves a great deal of process in the darkroom. Alfred Stieglitz. The Stieglitz family bought a place in Bolton, above Bolton, in the 1880s, and Alfred came here for every year. After that, it seems, it was an opportunity to get away from New York City. And I'm not including any earlier photographs that he did, but I think there's some fascinating ones that he did starting in the 1920s. This one here is sort of a typical traditional landscape of Lake George, taken from the hill in 1932. But earlier in the 20s, early 20s, he started taking photographs of clouds. At first, he referred to them songs of the sky. He saw a real connection with music. Later, he called them equivalents. And what he expounded was that they expressed pure emotion, paralleling the artist's own inner state. And that you can see many of these online. I only included a couple just to sort of get it started. And the other thing that by this point in his career is that he's starting to work more with straight photography, not doing all the manipulation in the darkroom, as we saw in the photographs taken earlier by Steichen. And so many of the photographs that you see from the 20s and 30s reflect that interest of his. They still are very symbolic. I don't necessarily understand all of that symbolism, but I've read that some people see in these pictures of these really old poplar trees a reference to his own mortality. There, I passed it on. It's a great photograph from my perspective, but for Stieglitz, there definitely was a lot more involved in his photography. When I looked at these two photographs of actually sort of immediate landscapes, I would call them, I see real parallels to the photographs that he was taking of the clouds. You see patterns there. I think they're fascinating examples of what he could do in that setting of being on their property up on the hill above Bolton. And I finished with this, another one of his equivalents taken in 1929. And I'll just share another quote. He described his process as one of trying to get down what I see. He wrote that his photographs were also born of an inner need and experience of spirit. I just have a couple more to go. This is Francis Bale, who trained as an engineer actually and worked for the Glens Falls Cement Company for 40 years. But his real avocation was photography. Starting in the first decade of the 20th century, he and his family would travel into the Adirondacks, including the Lake George area, on excursions, and he photographed as he did that. Here is one of his early photographs taken in 1913. You can just make out Dome Island against the mountain backdrop. And I've included these just as sort of a contrast to what we were just looking at with Stieglitz. Here we have what many of us think of as landscape photography. But I'm offering it also as a way of comparing it to what people were doing 100 years, not quite 100 years before, 80 years before, when they were using hand-coated glass plate negatives and large cameras and lots of chemicals. By this time, the technology was quite different. And because of that, you get a different look, definitely. Remember what I talked about before, how it was difficult to capture clouds in the 19th century? We looked at Stieglitz taking pictures of clouds. Here, the clouds are an important part of this photograph that Francis took looking north from Bolton, the Bolton area at the Narrows. I want to finish up by just a few photographs by Richard Dean. Dick Dean, as he was often known, Dean Color. Dick was born in 1913 in Brooklyn, and he went to the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he studied photography. He worked in Rochester for a number of years, really becoming a master of the color process. During World War II, he actually taught evening color classes in color photography, and then moved to Glens Falls after the war and set up his business here in 1947. What he's really known for are his postcards. And I just wanted to finish up with a few of those to bring this conversation up to the mid-20th century. As with many of the Stoddard and the other photographers in the 19th century, he photographed things that people were doing here at the lake. That's what was going to sell. People would buy his postcards as mementos of their experience here. And I'll finish with this one. View of the lake. So that wraps it up. We can open it up to questions.
Yes. So if anyone has a question, please feel free. We didn't have any come through the chat feed, but if you'd like to add one now, please feel free to do so, or just unmute your microphone and please ask.
Hello, this is Carrie Dudek from the Hyde Museum, and I'm reading our chat, and it looks like there is one question that came up about why the clouds were difficult to photograph, and the person was wondering if it was because of the background light.
Okay, I'm going to close my PowerPoint here and slideshow.
Oh, there you go. You got it.
Okay. The reason why it was challenging to get both is because of the sensitivity of the emulsions. When they were hand coding the negatives, they were, the negatives could basically just capture a certain range of light reflectance. So they would get a different amount of light being reflected off foreground versus what would be reflected even from the water or the sky, which would be the highest amount of light. So it was really challenging for them to actually get good exposures. In fact, you know, there are many Stoddard photographs that I found that, in his opinion, were not any good because they were overexposed. So what they would have to do is they would have to figure out an exposure to use to capture the foreground, and then take another picture of a sky where they would set up the exposure so they could capture the detail in the sky. They couldn't get both on one negative. Did I explain that? In later, when technology improved, they were able to come up with emulsions that could capture a much wider range of light levels. That was one of the improvements that came along over time.
Perfect.
And the way they would actually make the prints were made, they were contact prints that were made under bright light that would come in from like a roof window that often they would hang gauze on to make it diffuse, and they were contact prints. So they would put one of the glass negatives right against the printing paper that they would use, and they would sit it out under the sun for a certain period of time. They would print out, so it'd actually periodically check the print to see whether the image is developing. So it really required judgment, and every one was going to be different. You weren't using an exact timer at all. It was a fairly lengthy printing process. So if they combined two, they would actually remove the print, put a different negative in that frame, put the print back in, and then print that negative. And they would have to cut out an opaque piece of paper and put it over the area that they didn't want to print anymore with sky. I didn't show any examples in here, but in many of Stoddard's photographs, you can see where the sky actually that he used in his print, the sky overlaps the mountain in the foreground. You can see where clouds were printed right over the foreground. It wasn't real exact at times. Hope that wasn't too technical.
Sounded good to me. We have had a couple more questions come through. The first that I'll just address briefly is someone was wondering how long the J.S. Wooley was on view at the Hyde Collection. That's until January 3rd. And then our next question for Tim is, did the photographers have to write backwards on the postcard so that the titles could be read as normal when printed?
Oh. They would have to write backwards on the negative, yes.
Okay. Another question, Wooley took aerial photographs. Did others take to the air over Lake George in the early 20th century?
They did. Well, in the early 20th century, I'm trying to think of who did it. That's a good question. I've seen a lot of photographs and I'm not sure who took them until the mid 20th century, because Dick Dean did it a great deal. I don't have a good answer.
To be tuned. We'll add it to.
We will have to look.
We'll add it to the YouTube page. Let's see. We have a question. one of our participants is curious if anyone has recently looked at the photos in terms of climate change. Could they provide any evidence of the variations of the different seasons, the differences in species and timing of various plants leafing out or blooming, etc.?
I can answer that one.
Yeah.
Actually, it's now, I think it was 2012. We did, it was sort of an experiment. I got this idea that what if we were to take Seneca Ray Stoddard's photographs of the Adirondacks and sit down with biologists and have them try to identify the species of plants that are in the photographs, to see if there was a big difference. And what was unfortunate, the big challenge was the biologists are so used to being able to actually see the plant and see the texture of the plant, to actually see that, what the bark is like. They need color, and all of these photographs are monochromatic. So it was really difficult. For many of the photographs, you could identify certain trees because they have tree shapes, or the needles are like evergreens are pretty identifiable even from a distance. But for a lot of bushes and that sort of thing, they had real trouble. Often they'd say, well, it could be this, it could be that. But what we found is that perhaps the most interesting thing was that we found that in the 1860s, the New York State biologist had actually done a project in the North Elba area and collected plant samples, which are still stored down at the New York State Museum. And he included a description in the State Museum publication they did that year of all the plants that he found. We weren't able to really see any significant differences over that time period, other than there's far more forest than there was at that time because it had been logged off so much. So what you saw much more looking then to now is just how things have reforested. I know in the 20 years that I have been hiking in the area, there are places I can go back to that are totally different now, just because the plants have changed. They go through a succession, but it was really hard to find it in the photographs, other than, as I said, just seeing where places had reforested that in the 1870s were pretty clear, either because it was now farmland or just because they had been logged. That was the best word for it. But it was great to work with the biologists and just try to identify the plants that were in the photographs.
Yeah. Great question. A couple others here. Apart from the prints and postcards, have any of the original glass negatives survived?
Yes. They have, not nearly as many as the prints, because the prints could be mass produced. And the glass plates are pretty fragile. Many photographers, when they ended their business, they were just destroyed. And the other thing that's quite true is over that time period, they're very susceptible to damage, not only from physical damage, but from the environment. The emulsions, particularly with the hand-coated ones, they're not nearly as secure as the negatives that were made even by the 1880s. And acids or chemicals in the environment, the best way to put it, that are in the air, can work their way in from the sides, and you'll just see a lot of them are barely printable. That's the best way to put it. People always think, oh, I'd love to get the original glass plate negatives. And the other thing that anybody that's tried to print with them discovers that it is really hard to try to print glass plate negatives with the technology that we use now. Even 30 years ago, trying to print them in a dark room using modern papers was really hard. They work much better with the type of papers that they used originally. So, but there are still some in collections and in private hands, definitely. I didn't mention this, but by the 1880s, that was the beginning of flexible film, and that did allow more opportunities for people. Number one, it was a lot lighter, and as in the Wooley photographs, those panoramic photos are only possible using a flexible film because it could be bent in a curve. But the technology certainly made a big difference. I don't know whether I even answered that question.
No, you did. You did great. Another one here. For photographers who lived in Glens Falls, do we know where they lived? And if so, are their houses still here?
I didn't look for the addresses for the photographers. It would be more difficult prior to there being city directories or census records, but many of them I'm sure could be found. Those that had studios often moved them. They would only be in one place for a few years, and then you find them a few years later being in another location. We know where Stoddard lived, and that house is no longer around. But I haven't looked to see where the others lived. But it could be found, I mean, especially if they were living in the area in the later 19th century, that could be found in the city directories.
We do have a participant who offered some feedback there. They said George Conkey lived at 24 Warren Street. Alexander Orr was at 7 Ridge upstairs. And George Irish was at 100 Glen Street.
Is that where they lived, or is that where their residences, I mean, where their studios were?
They did not specify, but
yeah,
studios. They just chimed in.
Somebody had quick access to an online directory.
Yeah. All right, and we have one more question here, and this one came from our YouTube feed. They asked, many artists were painting the lake at the same time. Are we aware of friendships between the photographers and the painters?
It's not well documented. We can surmise that they may have had contact, but I know Jill Cutshall-King was actually trying to address that topic and did a great deal of research on it. And it's not that big of a place. So I think you could safely say that people were probably aware of each other. We just don't actually have references to them actually meeting or spending time together. That's my best answer.
Sounded good to me. All right. Are there any last questions before I wrap up?
Is a comment all right?
Yep, comment's great, please.
I'm Rachel Isbell Branch from North Adams. I have a Keyspark historical collection of my great uncle, who was the 4th wireless operator in the United States. And I have 3 albums of postcards around the world that he sent to my grandmother Rachel, that I'm named after, and my grandfather. And I'm so grateful for this presentation. And now I have to go and look and see if there are any of the photographers that you were talking about in this collection. But the collection, as I said, goes from 1898 to 1928. And it's a real treasure. So thank you very much.
I'm surprised if there aren't any.
Yes, yes. And you've just opened another avenue for me. I guess I've got to go do some exploring. But thank you for a lovely presentation.
Oh, and before we finish, I see Dan Ways here. I know I used one of his photos in the show and I didn't acknowledge it, but thank you, Dan.
No problem.
All right. Any other feedback, comments? All right. Thank you so much, Tim. That was amazing. I agree. That was a great presentation. I know we all enjoyed it because I saw our numbers stay the whole time.
Well, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening and for your support. As I briefly mentioned in the beginning, both the Hyde and the Chatman are open, so please come visit us. For more information about how to visit or see what we have coming up, please visit our websites. For the Hyde, that's www.thehydecollection.org. For the Chatman, that's www.chatmanmuseum.org. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we look forward to creating more exhibitions and programs for you, whether at home or at the museum. Have a great night, everyone.
Right.
Okay, so Tim, I'm just gonna keep this going until we get everyone out.